A man was crushed beneath a 2-ton car on the pavement of Bellevue Avenue. Screams, the grinding of metal, and the roar of an engine echoed through the usually quiet enclave of high society. Yet the most chilling detail of the case was not found at the scene. It lay in the decision made by heiress Doris Duke. When she pressed her foot to the gas pedal, she took the life of Eduardo Tirella. He was her closest companion and the only person who truly understood the darkest corners of her mind. For an ordinary person, having someone who understands them so deeply is a blessing. But for Doris Duke, that level of intimacy was an absolute nightmare. It drove her to silence her confidant forever. What could possibly turn a woman born at the very pinnacle of wealth and status into someone so isolated and ruthless? Let us look into the dark childhood, the psychological scars, and the extreme isolation of the ultra-wealthy to understand exactly what happened to Doris Duke, the man who knew her secrets and the art of the perfect facade. Eduardo Tirella was no ordinary interior decorator hired after a brief interview. In 1959, Doris Duke brought Tirella into her inner circle. She paid him an annual salary of $43,000. That was a staggering sum that far exceeded the income of most top professionals at the time. She wasn't just buying the services of a Bronze Star veteran with a cinematic eye honed in Hollywood. She was handing him the master key to the most deeply guarded rooms of her own mind. Doris carried a profound chronic wound. It was a core trauma born from the unique neglect that often plagues the children of tycoons. She grew up in the massive, suffocating shadow of her domineering father, James Buchanan Duke, and lacked the consistent warmth of a mother's love from an early age. As a result, her sense of self developed an extreme defense mechanism. That mechanism was absolute control. This wasn't meant for personal growth. It was built as a fortress to hide a primal fear of abandonment, a fear of being seen, and a deep insecurity that she was unworthy of genuine affection. For Doris Duke, a house was never just a home or a place to sleep. She owned 5 of the most luxurious estates in the world, scattered across prime locations. There was the imposing cliffside Rough Point in Newport, the sprawling Duke Farms in New Jersey, the tropical palace of Shangri-La in Hawaii, the Hollywood retreat Falcon Lair, and a lavish Fifth Avenue penthouse in New York. These were not simply vacation homes. They were architectural fortresses, meticulously designed to isolate her from the outside world. They were grand stages where she directed and played the role of the queen of an old money empire. Every antique collected, every hand-woven tapestry, every angle of light pouring through towering windows, and every locked room across her vast real estate portfolio was shaped and arranged by Eduardo Tirella. From a psychological standpoint, every room Tirella designed was a mask. It was a perfect shell Doris wanted to present to the public in high society to cover her internal emptiness. Doris didn't buy art purely to appreciate beauty. She bought art to consolidate power and to create a suit of armor made of aesthetics. It was all meant to convince the world that behind those stone walls lived an untouchable heiress. But Eduardo Tirella did not just stand on the outside admiring the work. He lived close enough, observed deeply enough, and worked long enough to intimately understand exactly how Doris built that facade. He knew exactly which antiques held true historical value and which were merely smokescreens to distract onlookers. More importantly, he knew where the gaps in her soul were, the voids that millions of tobacco dollars could never fill. Tirella was like a gifted artist acting as an unofficial therapist. He was the only person who held the detailed map of Doris Duke's inner world. He knew her sighs when night fell. He recognized the silent panic attacks hidden beneath her cold exterior, and he saw the crushing loneliness that surrounded her, even during the most lavish parties. This dynamic created a very dangerous paradox. In the world of someone with extreme defense mechanisms and deep paranoia about the motives of others, letting someone hold the map to your mind is never the start of a beautiful connection. It is a profound, ever-present threat. It was a risk that could bring down the entire defensive system she had spent decades building. The moment of departure and a keeper of secrets in panic. 7 years of devoted service to Doris Duke's exclusive world of aesthetics finally reached an irreversible breaking point. For Eduardo Tirella, beautifying, designing, and curating massive estates for the heiress used to be an appealing artistic challenge. It was a place where his cinematic design talents flourished with an almost limitless budget. He had the freedom to purchase the rarest antiques on Earth and turn mansion walls into masterpieces. But art could not indefinitely sustain the suffocating weight of such a controlling relationship. Gradually, Doris's need to possess Tirella's time, energy, and presence began to strangle his personal life. The world of Hollywood cinema and the creative horizons of the West Coast were calling to him. Out there, design projects were not chained to the erratic ego, the sudden rages, and the stifling clinginess of a tycoon accustomed to commanding the world. On the morning of October 7, 1966, Eduardo Tirella walked into the formal halls of Rough Point with a carefully considered decision. He officially announced his permanent resignation. He was terminating his 7-year employment contract, packing his bags, and moving to California to start a new chapter in his artistic career. This was no ordinary resignation that could be settled quietly with a polite handshake, a few social pleasantries, or a generous severance package typical of high society. Extreme wealth and absolute power had long isolated Doris Duke from any kind of equal human interaction. She was simply not used to being rejected, especially by those in her direct employment. In the micro-ecosystem Doris created, everyone around her was positioned either as a tool to serve her or a mirror to reflect her power. When Eduardo Tirella announced he was leaving, the action struck directly at her primal fear of abandonment. It was the exact moment her most destructive instincts flared as her ego faced the total loss of control over her environment. Tirella's departure wasn't just the loss of a talented associate or a brilliant aesthetic assistant. It meant something far deeper and more terrifying. It meant exposure. Doris was terrified at the prospect that the outside world might see the real woman hidden behind the powerful heiress, especially through the words of the man who knew her best. She feared that Tirella might, intentionally or not, reveal the truth. He knew that behind the billion-dollar empire and the marble walls lived a lonely, deeply wounded, and suspicious woman who was entirely incapable of maintaining healthy human relationships. Her extreme possessive instinct would not allow anyone to step out of her orbit while carrying the psychological map of her weaknesses. In the twisted logic of someone living in total paranoia, Tirella's departure was not a career change. It was a fatal betrayal. It was a direct threat to the survival of the myth she had spent her life building. The stage was set for a fateful confrontation in the cold hallways of Rough Point, where the thin line between emotional attachment and violent destruction was about to shatter. The reliquary box and a chilling test of loyalty. The argument between Doris Duke and Eduardo Tirella quickly exploded, echoing through the marble corridors of Rough Point. The tone was sharp, intense, and steeped in resentment. Tirella stood firm in his decision to leave, clearly stating his future lay in Hollywood. Meanwhile, Doris's voice grew sharper with every accusation of ingratitude, betrayal, and the rejection of the affection she had shown him for years. She could not accept the fact that after so much investment, both material and personal, this man dared to turn his back and walk out of her fortress. By around 5 in the afternoon, the heavy atmosphere in the mansion suddenly dropped. It shifted into a chilling, cold silence filled with a sense of foreboding. Doris changed her tactics. She lowered her voice to an unusually calm tone and shared a piece of news that seemed purely about art and commerce. A local antique shop in downtown Newport had just acquired a remarkably rare artifact. It was a 15th century reliquary containing the actual bones of an early Catholic martyr. For a collector obsessed with power, religion, and eternity like Doris Duke, this was the kind of museum-quality piece she desired to own at any cost. She sweetly and earnestly asked Tirella to do her a favor. As her most trusted aesthetic expert, she asked him to take a little time to accompany her and give his final professional opinion before she signed the purchase agreement. It was pitched as one last service before he packed his bags for New Jersey and then California. Behind the polite and elegant veneer of a simple request for art advice, this was actually a deeply chilling test. It was a silent judgment disguised in the name of beauty. Doris wanted to use the artifact as a tool to test his loyalty one last time. Would Eduardo Tirella yield, bow to her authority, abandon his plans to leave, and return to his familiar orbit of submission? When Tirella sighed and agreed to join her for that short trip, he had no idea he was essentially signing his own death warrant. That 15th century martyr's bone box carried an overwhelmingly dark symbolism for his own fate in his final moments. In Doris Duke's philosophy of ownership, everything in the world existed in only one of two states: It was either completely under her control, or it had to be rendered permanently immobile. The offer to view the reliquary was the fateful dividing line. If Tirella refused to exist as a living, submissive soul in her personal museum, he would be turned into a dead memory, permanently trapped in the heiress's silent collection. They stepped out through the heavy wooden doors of Rough Point and headed toward a light-colored Dodge Polara, its engine already running at the entrance. The 6-foot-tall wrought iron gates stood slightly ajar before them, preparing to open the way to an irreversible tragedy on Bellevue Avenue. The final act of possession and a machine-turned-weapon. The bulky Dodge Polara slowly rolled forward, approaching the sturdy wrought iron gates. Following a routine repeated hundreds of times over the past 7 years, Eduardo Tirella brought the car to a full stop. He shifted the gear into park, pulled the emergency brake until he heard the solid click, and stepped out to manually open the heavy gates. These gates were always kept securely locked to protect the billionaire's absolute privacy from prying eyes. He stood there in the quiet of the late afternoon, exactly on a highly symbolic boundary. It was the line between the safe fortress entirely controlled by Doris Duke and the vast free world outside that she could never reach or own. Inside the cabin of the car, a very different scene was unfolding. A 13-year-old boy named Bob Walker was riding his bicycle past the estate to deliver the evening paper for the Newport Daily News. He heard harsh, fragmented arguing coming from inside the vehicle. The shouting was abruptly cut off by a terrifying, brief silence. That silence was immediately followed by the deafening roar of a massive engine accelerating without warning. All the physical evidence later collected at the scene completely shattered the theory of an accidental pedal mix-up. The deep tire gouges in the gravel, the location of the blood and tissue on the asphalt of Bellevue Avenue far from the gates, and the horrific bone fractures recorded in the official autopsy report all pointed to something else entirely. To move a heavy older model car like the Dodge Polara from a complete stop to launching forward with such immense acceleration, the person sitting in the passenger seat would have to perform a highly conscious sequence of mechanical actions. They would have to reach across the center console, use physical strength to release the heavy emergency brake, shift the gear past the safety locks into drive, remove their foot from the safety brake, and finally press the gas pedal flat to the floorboard. There was no room for the random mistake of a slipping foot. It was a deliberate chain of actions, calculated by a twisted survival instinct and an eruption of ultimate rage. The car surged forward, plowing directly into the man standing at the gates. The tremendous impact threw Eduardo Tirella onto the hood, before his body slammed onto the asphalt. According to the young witness's verified account, the car then emitted a chilling screech of brakes. A second roar of the engine echoed through the air before the weight of the 2-ton machine rolled over the victim. He was dragged a long distance down the street before the car finally crashed through the fence of a neighboring estate. This was not simply a spontaneous act of violence. It was a final, extreme act of possession. Doris Duke refused to let Eduardo Tirella walk out of the story of her life on his own 2 feet. She pressed the gas and crushed the life out of her confidant not just to stop him from leaving, but to preserve her own myth. It sent the cruel message of a ruler. If you refuse to stay in my world as a living, submissive being, you will stay here forever as something buried within the stationary orbit I have created. The curse of inheritance and the isolation of extreme wealth. To fully understand why a woman born at the pinnacle of wealth and ultimate power could ruthlessly crush the life of her confidant right outside her own gates, we must step back into the past. We have to look at the root wounds that shaped Doris Duke's character. All of Doris's personal tragedies stemmed from a fateful and incredibly damaging dying wish. James Buchanan, Duke, the brilliant father who built a massive tobacco empire from the ashes of the American Civil War, left his 13-year-old daughter with a strict warning before he died. He told her never to trust anyone in this world. That warning took deep root in Doris's young mind. It eroded her ability to build trust, empathy, and genuine emotional connections with others. For a child who had just lost the protection of her father, the warning turned the world around her into a dangerous battlefield, where every person looking at her had an ulterior motive. Doris's childhood and adolescence unfolded behind the towering walls of her Fifth Avenue mansion and the thousands of acres at Duke Farms. She was constantly surrounded by a bustling staff of servants, muscular bodyguards, private tutors, and nurses. Yet, There was a complete absence of children her own age with whom she could share the natural joys of growing up. At age 14, another terrifying milestone occurred. Doris opened hidden paper bags kept in her late father's safe. Inside, she found threatening extortion letters, bloody ransom demands, and hundreds of marriage proposals boiling with greed. They were sent by strangers from all over the country simply because the Duke name was attached to a massive fortune. From that moment on, Doris Duke bitterly understood that money did not bring true freedom. On the contrary, it turned her into a prized item on the auction block of human greed. It reduced every social relationship to a hidden transaction full of deceit. Her later marriage to James Cromwell quickly dissolved into disputes and ended in divorce. Her short-lived romances suffered the same tragic fate due to her obsessive suspicion. She was constantly tormented by the question of whether the person across from her loved the real woman or if they were merely embracing the Duke family vault. Extreme wealth turned Doris's mansions into closed social structures. They were gilded cages where quiet hostility and psychological manipulation became the only rules of survival. Unable to find safety in any flesh and blood human being, Doris clung to pets, to lifeless antiques, and to massive estates. She allowed herself to be entirely consumed by material possessions, owning everything but losing a sense of human connection. Absolute power did not save her from loneliness. Instead, it made her the most tragic victim of the very walls she built around herself, sealing the myth and the ultimate price of privilege. Immediately following that bloody afternoon at the gates of Rough Point, the protective machinery of American privilege kicked into high gear. It was a stark demonstration of how money can bend justice. Local police chief Joseph Redis personally took over the scene. He escorted Doris Duke away in absolute safety rather than applying standard criminal investigation procedures for a murder suspect. There were no alcohol breath tests administered. There were no toxicology screenings. The only official interrogation took place 2 days later, conducted right inside the luxurious bedroom of her estate under the watchful eyes of a team of formidable lawyers. In just 5 short days, the case was officially closed with a neat and tidy conclusion. It was ruled a tragic, unintentional traffic accident caused by mistaking the gas pedal for the brake. But Doris Duke knew better than anyone that escaping the courtroom was not enough to protect her eternal legacy. Her urgent need was to permanently seal the memory of Eduardo Tirella away from the history books of high society. Not long after his death, massive donations began flowing into Newport's welfare funds. This included the establishment of the Newport Restoration Foundation, backed by highly influential figures. This effort peaked when Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis was invited to serve as the foundation's vice president. However, crimes covered up by wealth can never buy true peace. Suppressing the truth of Tirella's death created an irreparable psychological fracture for Doris. Her conscience constantly gnawed at her, turning into severe paranoia, an obsessive fear that her secret would be exposed, and a deep mental breakdown as she entered her twilight years. The peak of this instability was reflected in a series of bizarre decisions in her old age. She adopted a grown woman as her daughter, only to quickly disinherit her just a few years later. She developed a habit of making late-night phone calls to old acquaintances, driven by a panicked fear of the crushing loneliness that surrounded her. The tragedy of Doris Duke's final years is a perfect reflection of consequence. When a person uses economic power to distort justice and strip away the life of another, their inner world and physical being inevitably collapse under the crushing weight of guilt. At the end of her life, when she took her last breath in October 1993, she left behind a massive fortune of over $1 billion. It was entirely donated to establish the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation. She left behind a grand philanthropic empire, yet one that felt chillingly empty. The woman who was rich enough to buy all the beauty in the world ultimately died in the total isolation. She took the horrifying secret of that fateful sunset at the gates of Rough Point with her to the grave. Mainstream history might remember Doris Duke as a generous patron of the arts and a powerful heiress. But those who stand behind those cold iron gates can still hear the echo of a 2-ton machine crushing a human life. It remains a chilling and haunting reminder of the incredibly high price that those at the very peak of privilege pay for the deep insecurities hidden within their souls. And as we look back to where this story began, we are left to wonder, in today's society, as people relentlessly curate flawless, glossy images for the public eye to hide their own internal struggles, Are we unknowingly walking the same path as Doris Duke? Are we willing to trade the truth and genuine relationships just to protect the illusion of a perfect facade at any cost?